From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. It's no great secret, and it's no great shame. You're tired. I'm tired. We're all tired from the pandemic. This feeling of being mentally exhausted has a name: pandemic fatigue. And you're not alone. Half of Canadians reported feeling this way back in the fall. Everything in our lives right now is set against the backdrop of the pandemic that has killed nearly 2.5 million people in a year. We've lost family and friends. We're worried about our jobs, our kids, our parents. We're stuck inside the four walls of our homes. And the vaccinations, our ticket out of this mess, aren't moving as quickly as we want it to. That's just a short list of grievances. Let's call it what this is. This is a lot to deal with. But just because we're tired doesn't mean it's over. So what's going on inside of our brains to make sense of what's happening? On This Matters, we're talking to Steve Joordens, psychology professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough. He'll help explain the biological reasons behind pandemic fatigue and how we can keep pushing through those mental walls till this is over. Hey Steve, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here with you.
So how have you been making sense of the pandemic? Have you felt like you've hit any kind of mental wall?
You know, I felt like I hit a mental wall almost the day it hit us. I had spent the previous weekend in New Orleans at an EdTech conference, did what you do in New Orleans, and then came back on that Monday when everything was sort of shutting down. And quite honestly, I was very anxious. I couldn't wrap my head around it, around the future. I couldn't really understand it. And that kind of prompted me to think about the lectures I always give about anxiety and to use some of the things I knew with my family, which prompted me eventually within a couple of weeks to create a free online course that's now available on Coursera.org, which is all about helping people understand what anxiety is. And then exactly that. What are some tips and strategies now that you kind of get it? And it's primarily, by the way, just a biological reaction to danger, to threat. And once you understand what's going on, then you can think of these tips and strategies and start to kind of take control. So my course is called Mind Control, which sounds ominous, but it's about controlling your own mind and not being a passenger, but learning how to be a driver.
Right. So some of these coping strategies, now that the pandemic has almost stretched on for a year now, you know, this term, pandemic fatigue, it's a bit of an umbrella general term for, I think, the mental weight so many of us are carrying around right now, or at least, you know, for the course of a year now. What sorts of things add to that fatigue, you know, that sense that we're in this slump?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to kind of recognize is this is all a reaction to what we call chronic stress or chronic anxiety. So we have this little Superman within us that sort of emerges when there's a sudden danger, and it makes us super strong and super powerful, gives us all this energy. You've heard of people like mothers lifting up their car when their kids were trapped. You know, that's this sort of beast inside of us, but it's really meant to help us deal with acute stresses, a bear that steps out, and we either fight the bear or we flee from it. And that term, fight or flight, is important because right now, COVID is the bear that won't go away. And we're always sort of humming along a little bit in that fight or flight. That's a more primitive kind of part of ourselves. And it's more connected to our emotions, our emotional basis, and it actually inhibits our frontal lobes. So a lot of us feel like we can't think as well as we could, as complexly as we could. And we may be more emotional. We may find that we lose our temper quicker, or we have, you know, more emotional outbursts. And yes, all of this reflects cortisol being flooded into our system for a long period of time, and that does physically exhaust us. And even worse than that, it actually suppresses our immune system if it's allowed to continue too long. And so that's what makes it dangerous, and that's what we're all feeling, that sort of weariness. And that's exactly why we have to find ways. We're never going to escape anxiety, but we can manage it. We can give ourselves breaks, and those breaks are really, really important.
So if I'm getting this right, you know, cortisol and the way our brains handle crisis, that fight or flight response, as you say, it's meant for momentary stresses or momentary crisis. It's not meant to go on for a year and longer than that. Our brains aren't built to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's our short-term survival. Like normally our bodies are doing digestion, and that's our long-term survival. Let's take our food, separate out the nutrients, deliver the nutrients, get rid of the waste. That's all long-term survival. And at some point we evolved this mechanism that says, oh yeah, but when there's a bear in front of you, Digestion doesn't matter. You got to switch into this. But yes, it's for what we like to call acute stresses, which means short, sudden. And when it becomes chronic, then it becomes dangerous. And actually, one interesting, I guess, historical side from that, this is a lot of work of Hans Selye from Montreal, a good Canadian researcher. And it was really groundbreaking because it was some of the first empirical evidence to show that our minds are affecting our bodies. That if there's something that we're worrying about, that we're thinking about continually, that we actually see physical consequences of that mental activity. And that's the bad version of it. But the good version of it is we can also use our mind to help us escape anxiety and other things. And so a lot of behavior therapies and such are based on this interaction between mind and body. And some of the original work was on chronic stress.
And then there are external factors, of course, too, in addition to the pandemic or because of the pandemic. Millions of people have lost their jobs. People have lost their family and friends to COVID and to other diseases. So there's also this additional anxiety on top of the present public health crisis that we're in. I imagine that, again, has to load onto people's plates.
Yeah, and on top of all of those loads, our go-to strategy, what we like to do when we feel any negative emotion is reach out to the people we love. And if the emotion is strong, we want to hug those people. That's our security, is through our social connections. And so not only did it sort of layer all this anxiety on us, but it also took away our go-to strategy where you cannot be physically close to people the way you would like to be. And one of the lessons from that, by the way, is we have this term social distancing, and we've heard it corrected a few times, but that correction is important. It's physical distancing. That's what we want. Socially, we actually want to become closer with those people we love if we can. And that's a little trickier now because we used to have social connections in a very organic way. We'd go through our day and we would just run into people and we would chat and we would have who knows how many social interactions in the day. Now we don't. And so what we have to do, in my opinion, is to be more proactive about that and actually schedule, outreaches with various people and kind of in a sort of artificial way, recreate the kind of situation that we would have before COVID. So maybe reaching out to different individuals in different weeks, some old friend from high school or whatnot. But those social interactions are really important. And I also like to say to consider the telephone. Like if anyone's watched Stranger Things, and they're showing these kids in the 80s when they sit there for hours on the phone. That's how we did it back in the day. There is something about the phone that I think people should appreciate in COVID. And there's really two things. One is when we're on the phone, we're paying attention to the person we're talking to. When we're on a Zoom call, maybe not. Everything else is in front of us. And sometimes we're only half paying attention. They know that. And that feels more distant. But secondly, in anything like a podcast, for example, there are the words, the message, but then there's all those little other sounds. And you just heard my voice kind of take on a different tone as I said those other little sounds. And they are where the mojo is. And so those non-verbals, which often Zoom calls don't really translate as well, they come across really well on the phone. And so having a call, and it can be about, just talk about some TV show, Masked Singer, let's watch it and let's just call. But having that person listening and reacting to you, that ends up making you and them feel a little more connected, a little more safe, a little more secure.
Yeah, well, not to, trumpet our own horn or anything, but I think that's probably a big part of the reason why people really love podcasts, really love listening to radio, is because it feels intimate. It feels like a real connection. There's fewer distractions to take you away from what's actually happening.
You become sort of more immersed in that interaction. In my opinion, a phone call is more real than a Zoom call in terms that matter psychologically.
We'll be right back. And I want to talk about pandemic fatigue. Of course, it takes a real toll on our mental health. But epidemiologists have also said that there is a cost to public health too, that being all or nothing in our approach often causes people to tune out the advice. Is that another part of the fatigue that's going on, that people feel like, okay, I have to make decisions about things that I took for granted before, going to the grocery store. Now I have to think about, okay, mask use and hand sanitizer and what route should I take? These are all calculations that we probably never had to do before this.
And they're all being done to counter habit. That makes them exhausting as well. So if we think about the habits, and a very simple one, I could never find my keys, but I did what you should do, hang up a little hook somewhere near the door. And for those first 10 or 20 days, work really hard to put your key on that hook. And then before long, it just goes, it just rolls. That's what habit does for us. It allows us to not think and do things effectively. And so we had all these habits around social interactions, around how we behaved, and they were decades in the making. And now suddenly COVID says, you can't reach out your hand when you see somebody. And, you better remember to put your mask on before you do whatever. All of these things require our frontal lobes to be constantly thinking and reminding ourselves, okay, don't do what you're used to doing. You have to do it this other way. And we've been doing this for a year. It's just like when you have to monitor your kids.
You're second guessing all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're being very quiet. I got to look in on them. It's kind of like we're monitoring ourselves all the time. And, I think that's also why when we've seen some slips due to COVID fatigue, where people have, found themselves around others, and then they said, yeah, somebody wasn't wearing a mask. And so suddenly nobody was wearing a mask and people were having a couple of drinks. It seems you can be very judgmental of that. But in reality, what's probably happening is they feel so good to be able to just be what they think of as themselves. Like, this was me, just being me, not worrying about everything. And it probably feels so great in that moment, which is not an excuse, obviously, but it is how these things can kind of snowball quite easily, and the habits just kind of take over. And we love when we can just coast on our habits and don't have to overthink everything that we're doing. So yeah, I think that certainly is part of what we're all weary of. For me, I just can't wait to get back to that. And it's partially, by the way, why I predict in a number of cases what I'm calling the great snapback, which I wasn't sure about this as a psychologist for a while. Like, once it's safe, will we go back to how we were, or will we have all this new caution that we've learned from this fear? And I wasn't sure for much of the pandemic. After American Thanksgiving, and after what I saw in the airports of American Thanksgiving, when it still wasn't safe and they were already, perfectly willing to go back to family. And I think as soon as it's safe, we are just going to go running back to our old ways, which if we do it too early is a big problem, obviously. So that's the real tension we hear. We are now what we call deferring gratification, which is not something humans are good at either, but is a very important thing. And in fact, let me just throw out real quick. If anybody hasn't seen the marshmallow experiment, I highly encourage you on YouTube, and I can give you the 2-minute version, but it'll make you smile, which is good. The experiment's easy. We bring in kids anywhere from, say, 3 to 7 years old, sit them on a table, and we put a marshmallow in front of them. And we say to them, I'm going to go out of the room. I'll be out for a while. When I come back, if you haven't eaten any of that marshmallow, I'm going to give you an extra marshmallow, or sometimes 2 extra marshmallows, depending on how much you want to put it up. And then they close the door and this kid is there with a video camera on them. And so you get to watch these kids go through this period of extreme psychological pain as they sniff the marshmallow and lick the marshmallow and poke at it and try not to eat it. Some of them fail, some of them don't, as they get through it. We are at that point. The marshmallow for us is that old way of being. And it's kind of like we can't eat the marshmallow now. If we eat it now, we ruin our future and push ourselves back. And so when you watch these kids and the anguish that they're going through visually, I think you'll feel like that's a model of what's going on inside all of us cognitively as we just try to be good.
Right. The fight that's raging on inside of each and every one of us, of weighing the cost benefit of doing something, what's the risk, and that's playing out. You teach a course, as you mentioned, on how to keep ourselves perhaps more mentally strong and fit during this time. What kinds of coping mechanisms can we take from this? Like, how do people refill their tank during the pandemic?
So there's sort of 2 classes of approach that I talk about. And one of them is a sort of indirect approach, being able to get your mind to a better space by using the environment, by being attentive to the environment. So let me talk about that one first. And, I'll start with a negative example, which is when we look at the news, when we watch the news, or even listen to a podcast about COVID or anything like this, we are staring at the bear. I mean, we're kind of interacting with the thing that's scaring us. And it's very common that when people stop doing that, they will report anxious thoughts. So the environment has just fed in a bunch of worries and they're kind of chugging around. That's fine. Recognize that, recognize the things that make you anxious. And first of all, try to minimize those if you can. So watch as little news as you feel comfortable. But notice that there's also the flip side. There's other things, and we sometimes don't give these enough attention. Other things that bring our mind somewhere else totally. In my example is I've learned how to use GarageBand. I've had these songs bouncing around my head for years, and I've learned how to use GarageBand, and now I can sort of get a song out of my head and into reality. When I'm doing that, the rest of the world is gone. I mean, that is just where I'm at. And, it could be watching a trashy soap opera. It could be whatever. If it takes your mind away, first of all, recognize that, hey, I haven't thought about COVID for a while. What have I been doing? Maybe those are things I should do more of. And then there's other things that are especially sort of mojo full, because just like COVID floods us with cortisol, stress does, other things flood us with endorphins, and they kind of do the opposite. They are the antidote to the stress response. And so scheduling things like that into your day, karaoke Wednesday nights, and maybe watching comedies, because laughter is another powerful, powerful positive force. So if you can note the things in the environment that can, produce those sort of things, or if you can contrive them, I'm going to create something that's going to be funny or whatnot, those things have real value to take your mind somewhere else. So that's one class of just getting sort of intelligent with the environment and thinking about how to use it to control your mind, put your mind in a better place. The other class is in a way a more powerful one, but it's going to take a little bit more work. That system that makes us be anxious, we call that the fight or flight system. The other one we call the rest and digest. And they are actually sort of opposites, and you can't really be both at once. So one kind of pushes the other one out. And often when we're anxious, we say, stop being anxious, stop being anxious. So we're focusing on the anxiety. That makes the anxiety stronger. But if we instead learn how to relax, and it sounds easy, but it's technically not. And here's the analogy I like to give. It's like Star Trek Star Trek, get my sci-fi right.
They'll come for you if you get it wrong.
I know they will. They have the teleporter on Star Trek. And so the idea is, you can go there and just be beamed somewhere. Well, we can kind of beam our bodies into some state, but we have a need that they didn't have. They could just pick coordinates and go there. It's like for us to bring our body somewhere, we have to know that place intimately. We have to really kind of know what it feels like. And so there's a process people can go through using what's called guided relaxation audio files, and you can find these online, where someone will just walk you through a process of tensing muscle groups and then relaxing them and feeling what that relaxation really feels like. And if you can spend some time practicing, A, putting yourself into a relaxed state, but then B, really feeling it, really getting to know what that feels like. And people who meditate, regularly would know that feeling.
Yeah, I was about to say, it sounds like meditation.
Most of the guided relaxation use something called progressive muscle relaxation, but they are sort of just two ways to the same state. And the important thing in learning to relax is saying, okay, once you're in that state, really attending to that state and maybe even associating it with a trigger word. So I often use a word like beach or something like that. So you say beach to yourself over and over again. And eventually that word can become something where if you feel your anxiety raising, you can literally say beach, 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 pull the relaxation. And so this is a skill. It takes a lot of time, just like playing guitar. You're not just going to pick it up and do it. You have to devote the time and energy. But especially for our children, if we take the time to kind of walk them through, teach them how to get to this relaxing, peaceful space, teach them how to kind of summon that pretty regularly. The next time they're being bullied or, goodness knows what in their life, this is a tool they will have to kind of have control over their emotions. So a very powerful thing. And I'll, by the way, mention that a group of students and myself are about to release in about 2 weeks an app that's free. And it is just meant to kind of help people get that practice. So it has these guided relaxations at its core, but then of course it gamifies them to try to make you want to keep practicing and doing stuff like that.
It sort of sounds like what you're describing is building up a bit of mental resiliency, something in the bank that you can draw from that isn't such a short-term sort of fix, but that's something you can go back to again and again and again.
Yeah, in fact, I think this is one of the potential silver linings. So just to unpack resiliency a little bit, we use that word resiliency. A little bit more specific, I think this is a great time, to learn, to literally understand, what is anxiety? How does it come about? And once you understand it, you demystify it. So it's like, okay, this is just this fight or flight system. It is just this thing that reacts to negative things. And it's a good thing to have. The next time a wolf crosses my path, I'm glad I have this system in place to help keep me alive. And then once you understand it and you learn these strategies, they make sense. So suddenly, this mental health stigma or whatever becomes, no, it's more like Luke learning Jedi tricks. Here's my other sci-fi thing. There are people walking around allowing their mind and their body to just run away with them. And yeah, you can learn these skills, and then you become resilient because you now have the knowledge and the skills that can help you manage these situations. You understand what's happening, you understand why you're feeling, and you know what you can do about it. And absolutely, I think this is a time when stigmas about mental health are silly. Like if you're not anxious right now, you're not paying attention. We're all having mental health struggles right now. And so forget the stigma. Let's learn about it and let's learn some strategies.
Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through some of that. And hopefully this conversation helps somebody who's listening to maybe draw on that. And I love that analogy of staring at the bear. Maybe sometimes we need a break from staring at the bear. Thanks again for doing this.
Fantastic, Adrian. Thank you. It's great being with you.
That is Steve Joordens, psychology professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.